Armed conflict has been with us since the dawn of civilization. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of armies as far back as 10,000 BC. Military history has always existed on a grand scale, with legendary battles fought on land, sea, and air. From ancient daggers to modern medals of honor, in expert hands, these relics reveal the stories of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Join us as we unlock the secrets of Militaria. Today on Militaria, we will look at items that speak to the trying times faced in the world wars. These include a paybook of records, a gas detection kit, and medal groupings passed down through family. Andrew Moss looks at a collection of medal groupings, military honors given to those who served for their country.
We have a Second World War grouping. Now, who is that individual exactly?
That's Clarence Smith, my father. And he enlisted in 1939 and went overseas and served in England.
Kevin Robbins looks at a soldier's paybook, which includes a rich set of records and enlistment details.
The paybook is something that was issued to all members of the Canadian Forces, whether you're in the Air Force, the Navy, or in this case, the Army.
Gary Melville looks at a gas detection kit from the Second World War, once used to detect chemical agents.
Somebody brought this back from the war. Do you know what it is? And I said, no, I don't. They said, well, take it with you and see if you can figure it out. My name is Gary Sulikar. I'm retired military. The artifact belongs to the Legion down in Mahone Bay. Who gave it to the Legion? Nobody knows. I wasn't sure what it was at first, and it's a metal box. So I did a bit more research on that and found it's actually part of a kit for gas detection. So that's what I brought you today.
For all the horrors in the trenches of Europe during the Second World War, there was one threat that never materialized: poison gas. In the First World War, soldiers on both sides suffered and died from chemical attacks. By World War II, the Axis and Allies had stockpiled chemical weapons and improved gas masks, respirators, and other defenses. The Germans had invented a deadly new substance named sarin and produced enough of it to kill millions of people. But Adolf Hitler never authorized its use, despite deploying Zyklon B and other chemical agents in his death camps. The Allies were prepared to use their poison gases in response to chemical attack, but thankfully, it never happened.
Okay, Gary, welcome to the show, and I'm glad to see you brought in a very interesting artifact. I was wondering if you could tell us what you know about it.
Okay, this here was given to me at the Legions, and they said, somebody brought this back from the war. Do you know what it is? And I said, no, I don't. They said, well, take it with you and see if you can figure it out. So since then, I've just done a bit of research online and found out it was some sort of sensing kit for gas during World War II. It is marked for the German Army. And that's about all I know.
Right.
So over to you.
Okay, so what you brought in is a carrier for the ampules that the Germans used for a chemical detection kit.
Okay.
So the top pulls up and then it folds down.
Mm-hmm.
This was worn on the belt. We can see where the belt goes through these loops here. So they'd open this up, take out the little ampule, put it in the pump sort of thing, close it up. It would crush the two little glass beads so the chemicals would go into the batting. You'd pump it a few times to suck the air through. And then if it changed the colors in accordance with this, it meant that chemical agent was there. There was 4 different ampules to test for 4 different types of chemical agents. So Gary, when you were researching this artifact, what did you discover in the way of why they were used during warfare?
Well, the first gas attack I remember reading about was January 1915 in Russia. It didn't really work. The one we all know about, the big successful attack, was Second Battle of Ypres, April 1915, when the Germans unleashed chlorine gas on the French. The French territorials took it right in the face, and they just broke and ran. The Canadians filled the gap. They took it too, and I mean 2,000 guys died there in 3 days at that battle. But the young German troops were really nervous about moving forward through that gas field because nobody knew for sure what was going on. So this hesitancy of the enemy to, okay, we got this going, and it's hurting those guys, but is it going to hurt us if we move through it, eh?
Yeah.
So, you know, it works both ways. But
well, and that's the issue with gas. It's indiscriminate, and you can't control it once you launch it.
And if the wind shifts and starts blowing back at you,
Precisely.
it hasn't worked out so well.
Mustard gas is an irritant. So It's a liquid spray, so the droplets go on you, and it's not unlike poison ivy. There's a liquid on the leaves. When you rub it against you, your skin will turn red, or you get some bubbling. Well, imagine the bubbling probably 100 times worse. Then imagine ingesting poison ivy and it going down your throat and causing irritation, swelling, and bubbles. Well, that's what mustard gas would do to you. Chemical agents were used throughout the First World War, and as a result of that, there was a bit of an expectation that it may be used again, which is why all the troops were issued with gas masks. However, in 1925, they signed what was called the Geneva Protocols, and that was to ban the use of chemical agents during warfare. The signatories to that said that they would not use it. Of course, all bets are off in warfare, as we both know. Besides losing, and as a last-ditch effort, it probably doesn't matter what they have signed and what they've agreed to. So,
I knew that, to the best of my knowledge, gas as a weapon wasn't used in the Second World War. Hitler had such an aversion towards it as of his experience as a corporal in the Great War.
On the Western Front, it wasn't used. However, the Japanese used chemical and biological agents against the Chinese when they were invading China.
Oh, okay, yeah.
During the Second World War, the Japanese used both chemical weapons and biological weapons against the Chinese. The difference between chemical and biological is that the biological makes you sick from a disease of some sort. They dropped small animals with fleas that were infected with the plague, and as well as using other chemical agents against them. The Japanese, in the tail end of the Second War, when the Americans were getting close to Japan, there were plans for them to use biological agents against the Americans, but both times it failed because the vehicle that was bringing the agents was discovered and destroyed. And then even as recently as the Iran-Iraq war, Iraq used chemical agents against Iran. So they're still out there. You know, as you remember in your time in the Army, and as I do, we always prepared for chemical warfare. We always had our gas masks. We always did the decontamination and all that sort of good stuff. And you as an engineer, I'm sure you did that more than I did as a tanker.
Yeah, but I'm glad we didn't have to carry those damn gas masks in Kandahar.
Yeah. Well, Gary, thank you so much for bringing this wonderful artifact in. It's not something that we have in the museum. So should the Legion decide that they don't see it as part of their display in the branch and would like to send it our way, we'd really appreciate receiving it.
Well, I'll be having a meeting at the Legion, and I'll bring it up and ask them, okay?
Yeah, wonderful, because, you know, it's one of those things that probably in a display case of the Legion doesn't look like anything, and
Just,
yeah, whereas, you know, with a little bit of an explanation or incorporating into one of our displays, it might bring some education to people, or we could even use it in our education kit that we send out to schools.
no.
It's good to see you again.
Good to see you again, too.
There's legions across Canada that are full of very interesting artifacts. We need to open the doors, get people through, and tell the stories that our predecessors brought home with them.
Coming up on Militaria.
The Paybook is something that was issued to all members of the Canadian Forces, whether you're in the Air Force, the Navy, or in this case, the Army.
My name is Bill MacDonald, and I brought my father's World War II soldier's paybook. When my father passed away in 1978, my brother was executor, and he offered the paybook to me because he knew I had an interest in history, but didn't have a great relationship with my father, kind of ambivalent about it, threw it in a drawer, left it there until years later I ran across it and kind of had another look at it.
Reconnaissance units scout ahead of a larger military force to determine the location and capabilities of enemy troops, as well as information about terrain and infrastructure. Today, satellites and drones help gather intelligence, but during the Second World War, the only way to get it involved putting soldiers in harm's way. While air surveillance helped, it couldn't provide the same level of detail as having boots on the ground. Canadian reconnaissance units were typically outfitted with radio communications, motorcycles, and lightly armored vehicles that sacrificed defensive capabilities for speed. When the opportunity arose, recon units would attack weak enemy positions, but strong points would be identified and left for the larger assault group.
We're here with Bill MacDonald, and Bill, you've brought in a family heirloom.
This is my father, Bill MacDonald's World War II soldier's Paybook, and it kind of spurred me on to get his war records because the regimental numbers indicated in there. And it's kind of been a journey of insight into him and also his regiment, the 8th Reconnaissance Regiment.
Oh, yeah, exactly. The Paybook is something that was issued to all members of the Canadian Forces. It have all his pertinent information, his attestation number or his service number, with increases of rank and pay. They'd carry these with them all the time, but this is sometimes one of the most common things people save from their time in the service, because a lot of times these in the First and Second War could be used to validate military pensions or prove the fact that they were in the service.
They're well worn.
They're well worn. His whole war is here. And again, we were talking about your dad and that he enlisted in 1940. The Saskatchewan Light Infantry.
Machine Gun Division, apparently.
He transferred over to the 8th Recce Regiment.
That's right, in England.
The 8th Reconnaissance Regiment were the eyes and ears of the Canadian 2nd Division. The reconnaissance units are always way out in front. They go in and they literally see who's holding the roads, who's set up in a town. They supply that information that goes to the intelligence section, which goes back to the sort of overall arc and command of the division and the army as such. The 8th Reconnaissance Regiment are the first Allied troops to occupy Dieppe in the campaign when the Germans have left. To give people an idea, the distance between a reconnaissance outfit and the main body that they're part of, they hold Dieppe alone for 14 hours before the rest of the army meets up with them, Reconnaissance regiments, the armored cars, light armored vehicles like that will take a lot of hits and punishment from German heavy artillery 88s, 75 millimeter guns and Panther tanks, 88s from Tigers. So it's a very precarious way to conduct the war. You're way out in front and everybody else is away before they're going to catch up with you.
I didn't know anything about them till I started reading about them, and I was amazed. That term that they described them as the irrepressible 8th Recce.
Irrepressible.
And so their battle honors, I was amazed at.
Yeah.
They actually spearheaded the liberation of Falaise and other cities and towns. Battle honors were really quite incredible.
Oh, they are. The summer of 1944 to the spring of 1945, they're a very, very active regiment, the 8th Reconnaissance Unit, to the point that you can look at their battle honors for the Second World War. They have 15 battle honors, and those are acquired again from July of 1944 to the crossing of the Rhine in 1945 and the surrender in Nazi Germany. His father would have been in almost constant combat. He would have experienced a long, hard role.
Public Archives Canada sent me basically all the records that they had, his service record. So almost 10 years from the time that I first got the payroll book to the time that I then went to Ottawa and thought I kind of wanted to know more, resolve some of my outstanding grievances and issues with my father. This paybook ended up kind of being a bit of a touchstone, a doorway into kind of learning a lot more about him and really increasing my appreciation for the experiences that he and my Uncle Harry and others had in World War II, and that a lot of what happened to them, their experiences, they came back and didn't process very well.
No.
The drinking, the fighting, the womanizing. My father abandoned the family when I was 3, I think, and then kind of came in and out of our lives over the course of many years. The one that kind of struck me, I suppose, is his exit interview. And so here was this Captain Irwin, who then got my father in front of him, the war's at an end, and his description of him, which I read with great interest, says, "This physically fit, keen-eyed, 24-year-old man has an attractive appearance, is gentlemanly and appreciative, and has a manner that pleases the public." So certainly not the guy that I grew up with and knew. Those kinds of issues with my father, I think, might have gotten even more aggravated in wartime and kind of just brought them back with them and stuff. So I prefer to remember that exit interview description of my father. I think that's a really nice one.
For, again, those earlier generations of Canadians, people really had no great understanding of what a lot of people went through. Veterans did. They all knew what they'd gone through. But again, they come from that generation, especially the Second War folks, of the old expression of you carry your own water, means you carry your load with you. Did you ever speak to your dad or hear your father talk about his time overseas?
Only one particular time. The only person that he knows that he killed was the subject of the discussion. And because they were a reconnaissance regiment, because they went ahead of everybody, he came into a clearing buildings, I guess, and he came around a corner in one building, and there was a German soldier. They came face to face with each other, and the German soldier moved sort of towards my father, at which point he drew his weapon and shot and killed the German, realizing, of course, that really what he was doing was perhaps surrendering his rifle. So that's probably why that stayed with him, and that's probably why he shared it.
Yeah. Well, again, Bill, I'd like to thank you again on behalf of the program and the Army Museum
thank you.
for bringing this in and sharing with us.
This was a healing journey for me.
Great.
And it was all kicked off by just this little soldier's payroll.
Soldier's paybook. Yeah.
I would encourage everybody who has a family member who served in whatever the conflict might be to get their service records and gain that kind of insight into them.
The big thing of what we do at the Army Museum is we kind of bear witness for these past generations of Canadians that have gone overseas and fought, died, or maimed, or came home and maybe not have lost a leg, but their souls are marked by the experience of war. It'll give you a greater appreciation and a knowledge of what your family went through and the people you knew but did not know completely because of the things they never shared.
Coming up on Militaria.
That's Clarence Smith, my father. And he enlisted in 1939 and went overseas and served in England. My name is Janet Davis, and I brought in a collection of different groupings of medals from my family. Over the course of the years, as family members have passed away, things have come to me. I've kind of become the caretaker for the family.
The tradition of bestowing military honours dates back at least 4,000 years to ancient Egypt, with a decoration known as the Order of the Golden Collar. The Romans celebrated valour and victory with sculpted discs called phalaria, often made of gold or silver. These were the ancestors of modern military medals. Some Canadian medals commemorate participation in specific campaigns, such as the United Nations Service Medal, presented to all who served in the Korean War. Others recognize individual acts of courage, like the Distinguished Flying Cross. Military medals can live beyond their recipients. Families treasure them as heirlooms of their heritage. Collectors value them for their history, and museums preserve them to remember those who sacrificed.
Janet, welcome to the show today. You've brought us some medal groups to look at. So how did you come by these?
They've all been handed down. My mom had a lot of them, and when they passed away, of course, I became custodian of them.
You have a First War trio of medals here. What's the name of this individual?
That's my grandfather, John Mitchell, and he passed away the year before I was born. So all I know of him is what I've been told by my mother.
And he's in the picture right here.
Yes.
Now, the gentleman on his right.
That would be his father.
Okay.
My great-grandfather.
And they were both served in the First World War together.
They both served in France during the First World War. Not in the same battalion, but they did serve at the same time.
We have a trio of medals from the First World War, the 1415 star, which indicates that John Joseph was overseas in 14 or 15. And right below that, you have a wound stripe, indicating that the individual was wounded in action. Now, I quickly went through his file. He received a gunshot wound to the jaw, and interestingly, he was kicked by a mule as well. This grouping is actually named on the edge of the medals, and it indicates that John Joseph Mitchell was in the 25th Battalion.
Yes.
From Nova Scotia. And the 25th Battalion was one of the first battalions overseas, and was one of the first ones to see combat in the First World War. And over here, we have a Second World War grouping. Who is that individual exactly?
My father, Clarence Smith.
What can you tell me about him?
He enlisted in 1939 as soon as the war broke out, went overseas and served in England. And he was over there for the duration. After he came home, he met and married my mother. They married in 48, and he was just my dad.
Yeah, but, you know, a Canadian hero, really.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And did he ever talk about his experiences over there?
No. The things that they went through, I don't know, because they didn't talk about it. You get little stories, like some funny little tidbits and things like that. But they just went and did what they thought was their duty, and then they came home and started a new life. back then they didn't know about PTSD. So they just kept their mouth shut and carried on.
And we have a picture of him right here. And we notice that he's got the overseas class for the Canadian Voluntary Service Medal. All Canadian troops during the Second World War were volunteer troops. And so when you're a volunteer for service overseas, you got the clasp that would be attached to the Canadian Volunteer Service Medal. Now over here, who's this individual?
That would be my uncle, John E. Mitchell. He would have been the son to the John Mitchell from the First World War, and my mother's brother. He served in the Navy during the Second World War. He served in Korea on the corvettes, and then I remember he served on the Magnificent, the aircraft carrier.
That would be in the post-war period.
Yes, and stayed in the Navy until he retired. I think he either had 20 or 25 years service when he retired, I think in the early 70s.
And he's got an Atlantic Star and an Africa Star, and they both have clasps. We have the United Nations Medal and the Korea Medal for the Korean War. And at that point, he was on the Magnificent?
Yes.
Okay, that's a very interesting grouping. And over here?
This is my mother, Phyllis Marion Smith. Her maiden name was Mitchell. She would have been John's sister.
And that's a CVSM and a war medal?
Yes.
And what can you tell me about her?
She joined the Air Force in, I think in 1941 or 42. And she went to Ontario for training. And then she was posted in Halifax, and she worked at the Maritime Tell building on North Street, worked with the telephones.
Okay, so, communications.
Communications, yeah.
Radio operator communications, interesting.
And late 42, she was given a discharge on compassionate grounds because she was needed at home. Her father, John Joseph, wasn't well.
What's interesting is you have a photograph of her. She's wearing the Royal Canadian Air Force Women's Division kepi with the Royal Canadian Air Force badge, a section of the military that was really undervalued until fairly recently. Over 50,000 Canadian women served during the Second World War. The roles that were available to Canadian women during the Second World War were, of course, the military, the Women's Royal Canadian Naval Service, the Wrens. There was also the Royal Canadian Air Force Women's Division, and the Army had the Canadian Women's Army Corps. In addition to women serving in the armed forces, they also were working in factories producing armaments and tanks and aircraft that contributed to the defeat of the Axis powers during the Second World War. So, Jana, what are your plans for these medals after today?
Actually, we would like to donate them to the museum.
Yeah, I'm sure the Army Museum on Citadel Hill would be very interested in the Army aspects. Especially, it would be great to see a women's division grouping done up and displayed from a local individual. And of course, the Naval Museum, I'm sure, would be very interested in your naval groupings, considering that this individual served on corvettes and served on the Maggie, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah, so that would be a great addition, I think, to their collection. Thank you very much for bringing them in. Appreciate you sharing your family's history with us today.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad that we got to show them, and all the information is very appreciated. I think it's important that we remember the past. I'd like the youth to know what the grandfathers and their great-grandfathers did to give them the life that they're living now, the sacrifices that people made to keep us safe, and I think they should be honored.
I think a lot of Canadians today have some interesting aspects of their family history to do with Canadian military. Dig into your family's history. You never know what you're going to find.